Well, lo and behold, here we are again, another edition of Conversation Collage coming at you from Wenatchee-Wa, the apple capital of the world, where it is now fall. The temperatures are cool and crisp, the leaves are turning, and the season is here. How are you? Ken Johannesson at your service. Stick around. I think we're going to have a fun one for you today. We're going to talk about baseball. Yes, as we produce this episode of Conversation Collage, the World Series has begun between the Houston Astros and the Washington Nationals. Personally, I don't really care who wins. I have no skin in the game. But I would like to see the Nationals win it. If Houston wins, that's fine, but the Nationals have never won, and Houston's won one. So I'm kind of rooting for the Nationals this time. Nationals/Expos, because, you know, they used to be in Montreal. Anyway, we'll see what happens. As we record this, the Nationals won Game 1 last night, and so we'll see what happens. Speaking of the Astros, they're kind of a topic of our first interview because it delves into a modern baseball game. We'll talk with Rob Neyer, who wrote the book Powerball, Anatomy of a Modern Baseball Game, and he takes it through the lens of one single game in September 2 years ago, 2017, between Houston and Oakland. And then we'll talk with Bernie Williams, Yankees legend. Yes, and we'll talk about baseball. We'll talk about his dad and the rare lung disease that claimed his dad's life. So it's a serious interview, but we have some fun in there too. And I found out something about Bernie Williams I did not know. Okay? And so stick around for that. First, let's talk about Rob Neyer and his book Powerball, Anatomy of a Modern Baseball Game. It hit bookshelves about a year ago. He explores so many of the intriguing elements of today's game through the lens of one game, as I mentioned, from September of 2017 between the Oakland Athletics and the Houston Astros. Within those 9 innings, Neyer captures the heartbeat of professional baseball, its intricacies, its trends, its future, the complete game, if you will. And we talked with Rob Neyer when Powerball came out. Powerball, Anatomy of a Modern Baseball Game. What brought you the idea of this book?
I wish I could claim it as my own, but just sort of out of nowhere in September of 2017, a book editor at HarperCollins came to me and said, Rob, I would love someone to write a modern-day version of the book 9 Innings, and I think you might be the right guy. And I was and remain a huge admirer of that book and its author, Dan Okrent. The book came out in 1985, and I probably read it 3 or 4 times over the next few years. So I'd never thought myself of doing that book, another sort of a modern version of that book, but someone else did, and it all came together very quickly. And so this examines one game, right? One game on September 8th, which happens to be my sister's birthday for some reason, but she doesn't care for baseball, so it doesn't matter. That's irrelevant. Why that game? Why September 8th between Oakland and Houston? Well, the book really is not about that game. It uses that game as sort of a skeleton on which to construct what I call a description of what I call in the book postmodern baseball. So we picked that game because of the A's and the Moneyball connection, which really helped sort of jumpstart this whole movement we've seen with analytics and sabermetrics and all the information that's come into the game. Baseball, all those things would have happened to some degree, but they really were. That process was accelerated when Moneyball was published in 2003, and I wanted to write about the Astros because they perhaps epitomize today's game more than any other team. Their front office staff, almost from the beginning of the current team's success, was built with by people who didn't have any experience in baseball. You had someone who was hired out of NASA, basically, literally a rocket scientist, as a director of decision sciences was his first title. The general manager had worked for the Cardinals, but prior to that had no experience in baseball whatsoever. Was hired because the owner saw all this information coming in and read Moneyball and thought, we need somebody like that in our organization. So, and then, of course, the Astros would go on to win the World Series last year, but we chose this game, and I started writing the book before the playoffs even started.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting that we're talking now the day after. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, the Astros were eliminated last night.
That's
Weren't
right.
they knocked out?
They were.
Yeah, they lost to Boston last night. So, but is this not a trend that we've seen? With the resurgence of certain teams. I mean, let's talk about Boston that came back from that horrible curse for 90 years or whatever, and then the Chicago Cubs that came back. And now Houston, and aren't we talking about essentially the same thing? I mean, those teams have kind of risen up in somewhat the same manners.
They absolutely. I mean, the Red Sox, in the immediate wake of, well, really before the Moneyball came out, the book, the Red Sox tried to hire Billy Beane, the A's general manager, and if anyone who's seen the movie or read the book knows that he ultimately turned down that job, but they then hired a 28-year-old as general manager. They brought Bill James aboard, the father of sabermetrics, and my former employer, by the way. And so that's what, they were already a good organization. They'd been a winning team prior to those moves, but I really believe that changing their focus the way they did is what led them to an era of stability that continues to this day. And now they're in the World Series again. It all sort of goes back to the early 2000s. Certainly the Cubs did. The Cubs, that kid that the Red Sox hired as general manager went to the Cubs eventually and rebuilt that franchise from the ground up, basically. And then they won the World Series. And the next year the Astros won the World Series. So, yes, it is a continuum. And there are other ways to win. The Giants won 3 World Series in 5 years without a significant emphasis on analytics. They certainly looked at things and had people doing that work, but not like these other teams we're talking about. The Royals went to 2 World Series in a year, and they were sort of, fairly or not, famous for eschewing the modern analytics. So there are lots of ways to win, but I think it's becoming increasingly difficult to win if you don't jump feet first into all this information that's out there now.
I've often wondered if the fans are too much, are deluged with too many stats, because now when you look at the screen during a game, it seems like you've got you don't just have RBIs, you don't have win-loss for the pitchers. You've got speeds, you've got velocity, you've got on-base percentage, you've got slugging percentage. Are the fans? I think it kind of detracts from the game a little bit to kind of be overstated. Do you think that? Do you think that?
Well, I don't, but I'm able to tune a lot of it out. I also pick and choose my broadcasts, quite frankly. For a lot of games, I will just turn the radio broadcast on. I can get it on my phone, any game, and the radio broadcasts tend to not be quite so statistics heavy, because they don't have any graphics to throw up there, so they just talk about the game. And don't get me wrong, I mean, I grew up with all these numbers. I'm perfectly comfortable with them. The problem is that too many of the broadcasters don't place these things in their proper context. And if you take a number and you don't place it into the context, well, then it doesn't mean anything. I think a lot of fans would welcome these new numbers if they're able to understand what they mean. They're supposed to illuminate the game, and not just be something that the broadcaster throws out to fill space. So they can be used well. I know some broadcasters who use them well, but I don't think that the broadcasts have caught up yet to what's actually happening out there.
Mm-hmm. Let's go back to this game, the September 8th, 2017 game between Oakland and Houston. What is it about this game that puts Powerball in focus, that explains what's going on?
Well, I wind up writing about 25 or 30 different, what I consider key elements of the modern game, both on and off the field. But at its heart, the game is based purely now on power, almost purely on power hitting and power pitching, and the power of all these new numbers that we're seeing now, and that that if we're not seeing, the teams are seeing. Powerful front offices, in a sense. So this game has a lot of home runs, a lot of guys hitting the ball really hard, and of course we have a measure for that now. Exit velocity, how hard the ball comes off the bat, which a lot of broadcasters have really fallen in love with. I try to contextualize it in the book and not lean on it too heavily, but the fact is people look at it a lot. You hear it all the time, and there were a lot of hard hit balls, line drives and home runs in this game. There weren't, unfortunately for me, a huge number of strikeouts, which is something else that epitomizes the modern game.
Yeah.
But, of course, I was still able to write about them. You only need one strikeout to write about strikeouts, and what this game did have was a number of pitchers who threw or still throw in the mid to upper 90s. And that's what pitching is all about now. I mean, the pure number of Major League pitchers who throw 95-plus has exploded in the last 5 years. And that's perhaps the biggest story in baseball right now, because the strikeout rate is also exploding, as you would expect.
Right.
And at the same time, as you would expect, the number of batted balls in play, that is, any batted ball that isn't a home run, has plummeted. There are roughly 20% fewer batted balls now in play than there were 30 years ago. That's a huge change in the game that people really don't talk about very much.
Right. Are all these changes, do you think, are they good? I mean, the purists might complain a little bit, or maybe loudly, but are all these changes, the emphasis on statistics, the emphasis on technology and finding out who's the best, how do you put together a good team, and are all these things good for baseball? In the end,
I wind up suggesting at the end of the book that perhaps they're not, and I spent years, frankly decades, espousing the new numbers, arguing for a more rational brand of baseball, more objectivity, and I don't really regret that. For one thing, I don't think I had much of an impact, but it is, in my opinion, all these new numbers and all the rationality has led to a less interesting game, because what has always made the game interesting, I think, certainly to me and to plenty of other people, was the variety. You could go to a ballpark and you wouldn't really know what sort of game you were going to see, and you might well see a stolen base or two or three and a triple and a great play by the shortstop, and any number of other things in that single game. Well, of course the same is true today. It's just not as true because the strikeouts and the home runs are eating up the game. And we are, with no end in sight, by the way. There's no suggestion that I've seen that these trends are going to change anytime soon. This year, for the first time ever, there were more strikeouts than hits. And I just don't believe that if you were starting from the beginning, if you were creating a new game from nothing, that's how you would design it. Just as they didn't design it that way in the 1860s and 70s.
Abner Doubleday wouldn't be he'd be rolling in his grave right now, huh?
That's right.
You want to believe that, yeah. Also, are we also looking too much, and we've talked, this has been talked about in decades, and they were trying to change this with more parity in the game, so where you don't have just the Yankees, the Dodgers, the big teams from the major markets dominating baseball. But it seems like we have come to that again, where not only for I guess attendance figures, but for television ratings and sponsorship, you need